This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe lure some men to their deaths. I'm Loren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Radha and Erin.
And as always, we are starting with our not Bombshell, but Sirens questions, but just one this time. I was inspired by this question because a friend of mine talked about how whenever they visit their family vacation place every year, their first meal when they go has to be ice cream, and their last meal when they leave has to be ice cream. And that can be any ice cream. It can be Burger King ice cream. It can be fancy ice cream. It can be Ben & Jerry's, whatever. So my question is, when you visit the place where you grew up, you always intend, because maybe you miss sometimes, you always do something or you explore something. What is it?
So I grew up in New York, and the thing we do is get bagels, and we buy them in large quantities and then take the bagels we don't eat and individually Ziploc back them and freeze them immediately. So you have fresh, air quotes, bagels. But the little twist here is we've discovered if you go on Wednesday, it's buy a dozen, get 6 free.
Oh,
that's a lot of bagels.
It's a lot of bagels, but also bagels are delicious. So,
do you have a specific location for said bagels?
We do. It is a specific location. It's a specific bagel place that has 2 locations, and you can actually only get the buy 18, get 6 free at the original location. So it's called JB Bagels. So if you go to JB Bagels 2, you only get you order a dozen, you get 1 free. So that's like a sucker's hit. So you got to go to JB, the original. Yeah.
Erin, what about you?
Mine's probably there's a couple things. I always intend to go to Lawrence when I go home because Lawrence, Kansas is the greatest place on earth. This occurs 1 out of every 6 trips home for the most part, because my family has like a tractor beam of pole and it's very difficult to escape those clutches. Although this last summer when I was home, my mom and I did go to Lawrence together and went to the Birkenstock store, which is possibly the most Lawrence thing you can do doesn't involve a basketball game. But the thing that I always do actually is I actually love my stepmom's enchiladas, and I make her make me enchiladas, even though like my sister and her girls don't like them. And so when I make the menu, I put enchiladas on there, and she's like, "Don't they not like it?" I'm like, "They didn't make the menu. I did, and I want enchiladas." So that's my probably most go-to home activity is eating enchiladas.
I similarly, my home is Texas, so when I go home, I must have breakfast tacos. And in particular, if I can find a place that has breakfast tacos there's not a great way to explain this. It's dried, shredded beef. And I don't know why, but I just love it very much. And you add that with eggs and beans, and it's just delightful. The other thing I always like to do is go on a hike on a day where it's a little bit humid outside and there's a bit of a mist and a fog rolling in. And there are places in Texas that have this sort of rich, spicy smell when you were hiking in the woods or nearby a creek. It's probably just like rotting leaves or something, but it just reminds me of being home, and I recognize it and I miss it so much when I'm there. I will totally take a Taco Cabana taco as well. It doesn't have to be only really good tacos. Taco Cabana, our Tex-Mex friend, but breakfast tacos, it's got to be where it's at.
I mean, I am a sucker for a Sonic or a Culver's when I go home as well, which we don't really have here in the DC area, and there is something pretty awesome about that.
Oh, Sonic is so good.
I do love a Sonic.
It's so good.
Well, we need to have Sonic, call us up. You can sponsor future episodes of Sirens here. We'll make up our own slushie and you can name it after us.
So we struggled quite a bit with our It's a Drill segment this week because there's a lot going on that I could make a lot of references to various baseball movies right now in terms of we've got a lot of shit going on here. Candlesticks make a nice gift. But instead, I will kick us off on our next round of It's a Drill topics where we get a very brief period of time to talk about something that is on our minds, that's bothering us, that people are gossiping about at cocktail parties. And with that, I will start with, I don't even know who to start with on this one. There's so many good things here. Erin, tell me more about what's on your mind.
So I cycled through several options here. I really wanted to talk about the new Australian climate visas, which are interesting. Then I wanted to talk about the various university capitulations, especially in the Ivy League. But I decided to stay a little bit closer to my core topics on this podcast, which are foreign policy or national security. And it turns out Taiwan was in the news. So defense watchers, I think, largely assume that the Trump administration is fairly hawkish, and they certainly have hawkish tendencies. And there's been lots of harsh language toward China. Secretary Pete Hegseth warned of China as an urgent and imminent threat at the Shangri-La dialogues in June, for example. And even if you look at like the $150 billion plus up for DoD and the reconciliation bill, a lot of that was toward capabilities that would be relevant, in fact, required in a Pacific type conflict. But there's actually some cracks in that armor or cracks in that mirror, depending on how you want to think about it. And so last week, the Trump administration denied a transit visa, that is just a visa to go through U.S. airports, to Taiwan's president. He had a tour planned of Latin America and was going to fly through maybe New York and Dallas. State Department denied that, and he ended up canceling the trip. At the same time, the Financial Times reported that in June, DoD canceled a scheduled meeting between Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Bridge Colby and Taiwan's defense minister, possibly to avoid upsetting the ongoing trade negotiations with People's Republic of China. So hawkish language, but not a lot of love per se for Taiwan. And for most folks around here, Taiwan is the primary use case or contingency that folks worry about in the Pacific. So very interesting to see where all of this kind of rhetoric and even budget allocation goes to if we are, in fact, not 100% sure what we're going to do about Taiwan. Interesting question.
This is one of the fascinating things to me about the China contingent and the I was about to say the Biden administration and the Trump administration, and that is the contingent that is very anti-China, hawkish on China, but entirely, as you say, not exactly sure about how they want to bring Taiwan into that conversation, because that brings up a whole lot of other challenges associated with it. And not, because I don't have to deal with it, I sort of love watching that drama play out.
Yeah, I mean, I will say there is this, it's just interesting to see the different factions that align on a specific point, like in this case, China hawks, fight it out on globalists and then, disagree on what interventions look like. For me, the thing I've been looking at is the recent AI action plan, which basically has 4 pillars. So it's intended to boost US AI infrastructure like data centers and chips, accelerate open source and private innovation, promote AI exports, ostensibly to allies, and then limit the federal use of so-called woke, air quotes again, AI. It's a really complicated and actually a lot of moving pieces, and I think we'll probably do something more full scale on it. But on the plus side, it really does try to outline a whole of government effort on American AI dominance. So it covers infrastructure and workforce and regulations. It seems, kind of to our earlier point on these competing factions, it seems entirely contradictory to the recent decision on, for instance, NVIDIA to lift chip exports and allow China to buy large quantities of these sort of exquisite microelectronics that allow the training and scaling of particularly powerful AI models. And then it's like pretty silent on a whole host of AI in like international power projection and AI as a part of our international relations, which had been a hallmark and in which many people, myself included, probably think is a core part of the U.S. advantage on AI. But it does do a lot of deep dives into how we should buy more and do more with the private sector. So I think, there's probably, again, a whole host of conversations to be had on everything from technology and innovation to some of the social elements to the data issues to the environmental risks to the like censorship / ideological concerns. But it was a broad-based announcement that that rolled out. And just one little other nugget is it really came together quickly and had basically representatives from every major AI and tech company innovating like in the US. And that type of event, frankly, is very impressive. And so I think the rollout of it and the impact of that having a substantive plan with all of the titans and new entrants from industry participating really, I think, was a strong signal of the administration's focus on it.
And so there'll be much more to follow on the AI executive order, AI action plan, because there's lots of different threads to pull here. But one I will just note very quickly is in the vein of personnel is policy. Radha mentioned the absence of some of the international affairs components that you saw, particularly under the Biden administration, be part of their major AI strategy. A number of the folks that would have ostensibly led some of those conversations or been a part of contributing to them were removed from the National Security Council in a series of I think Loomer attacks or any number of other things. The office that would have done this work was basically decimated. So in the absence of that, it's a really good question of like who carries that water into what end right now. My contribution to It's a Drill is my title is National Institutes of Health Funding Shenanigans, words that should not be in a sentence together. NIH funding and shenanigans. So you may have seen in the news that first an announcement that like, oh my gosh, in the latest OMB memo to National Institutes of Health, they made some of their funding available. It said in a footnote, hey, by the way, don't get out any of your research grants. Stop doing that right now. We're doing a review. What's interesting about this to me is that there was quite a bit of pushback against this when it was announced. It was not announced. It was basically caught in terms of a footnote and with lots of folks at NIH pushing back, as well as members of Congress of both parties and a lot of public outcry on this is going to have a huge impact on any number of ostensible priorities of the administration. Congress was pretty pissed off about it. And then you saw a lot of maybe not on program comments from the NIH director who criticized this and said there's not, or maybe not criticized, that's the wrong term, noted that Congress was not likely to be supportive of some of the cuts that are coming forward here. So then it was reversed. The White House put pressure on an OMB director vote and said, don't do this. That was reversed. But with the kind of quiet threat that you could see the cuts coming forward in what is called a pocket rescission as we get towards the end of the fiscal year, which has all kinds of fun legal implications that we will explore in a future episode.
Just another phrase that we shouldn't hear: White House pressure on the OMB director. Like, dude, you work at the White House.
Same building. It's also interesting to me, like public pressure does work. I mean, it's always, of course, public pressure works in political situations, but when it works quickly in these sorts of dynamics, it suggests that this wasn't briefed internally. This was not understood, and people were going to be unhappy about it, and that unhappiness may carry water down the lane.
I want you to know my initial reaction to that was like, wait, is Marco Rubio the OMB director? But he's not. So that is one of the jobs he doesn't have. And so, more power to them.
So moving on to our dumpster fires of the week of this episode, of which, again, we had so many options. And for some reason, we decided to go with Gaza because we all feel deeply comfortable exploring this in great depth in this moment. But however, to be fair, we actually do have an issue that we think deserves much attention. What expertise we bring to it is maybe not the same as you might find in other podcasts, but I do think there's a particular salient issue that I'll turn over to Erin to jump on.
Right. So as Loren noted, the war in Gaza was front and center again last week, and it felt like there might be some kind of change in the air. And I think that's really what's to be seen. So by way of background, for I would assume most listeners of this illustrious podcast are aware, but there's been a war in the Gaza Strip since October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched an absolutely brutal attack against Israeli civilians. Over 1,000 people were killed that October, and over 200 were taken hostage by Hamas. That has led to a series of negotiations and some hostage releases over time, but there still remain some number of people still held by Hamas in the region. Israel retaliated again in 2023 and since with a series of airstrikes and a ground invasion of Gaza with that stated intent of eradicating Hamas, which is the Islamist group which has governed Gaza since the previous war in 2006. Any of us with experience in counterinsurgency probably bristled a bit at the idea of eradicating insurgent or terrorist group. And I think a lot of what we've seen since then kind of proves the difficulty of doing so, especially when Hamas is so integrated, and whether you want to call that human shields or part of the civilian population in Gaza itself. Gaza has long depended on various forms of humanitarian assistance, which has become both a carrot and a stick in these international negotiations. Israel has frequently restricted trucks from entering through ground crossings, citing security concerns. The US, Jordan, and other countries have intermittently done airdrops to provide emergency humanitarian assistance, but that's almost literally a drop in the bucket. More recently, earlier this year in the spring, Israel significantly restricted aid at all ports of entry in Gaza, essentially sealing the Gaza Strip from all outside parties. And they also replaced the traditional or UN-based humanitarian assistance with a, quote, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is staffed by American contractors and is meant to provide aid within supervised zones by the Israeli Defense Force. So that kind of brings us through spring of 2025. We're now almost 2 years into this conflict. Maybe to Loren first, what are some of the underlying or even kind of objective things that have happened just in the last couple of weeks that suggest there's a bit of shifting of the winds?
So, this question should be something that is simple to answer, and I have answers for it, but I think it will be very interesting to see in like 6 months or so, with the benefit of hindsight, like what was the moment or the moments that really started changing things in both public perception, political perception, and otherwise. So I'll point to a couple that I think are probably pretty determinative, but why they were as large an impact as they had, I think probably deserves a lot more attention, not just in this moment, but over time to better understand like what was the true determining factor here. And these were a big deal. So we had first a United Nations affiliated organization called I'll call the IPC, that is the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification.
Boy, that's a
Issued,
mouthful. Really,
I
really
know
just,
IPC is better.
Rolls off the tongue.
So it issued a pretty consequential, dire, alarm blaring alert and report confirming what is effectively like worst case scenario, worst case famine scenario that is unfolding in the Gaza Strip. And like I think that we've been, whether you've been paying a little bit of attention or a lot of attention to this crisis over the last several months, the language that is used in this is like there's no question about it. We have moved from impending coming, the crisis is coming, these bad things are going to happen, to it is happening, and we are now crossing a line to various points of no return, both for communities, individuals, and the broader community there. In addition to that, paired with that, but in addition to that, there have been over the last several weeks a lot of really, really devastating images that have come out as paired with this report and from broader from other organizations that have been on the ground that show in real awful detail the devastating consequences of the famine, in particular with children. On top of that, at the same time, as a sort of like, this is the bad thing is happening, here's one of the causes of the bad thing that is happening, very explicit and specific criticisms of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which, as Erin mentioned, is staffed by American contractors within IDF zones, both in terms of the casualties that are being inflicted on individuals who are waiting in these zones for access to aid, the very, very limited amount of aid that it is being provided, the militarization of a process that is not meant to be militarized and didn't have to be militarized overall. And those criticisms, those are not new per se, but they have been far more universal and from audiences that you haven't heard them from before in these ways. And we'll get to that in a second. I think those are probably the big things that happen, and they are not just, I don't want to minimize them at all. It's more that for some reason they made a true difference in public mind, in public commentary, and public feedback in a way that the last several months have not.
So that brings us now to this week. And maybe we can go through, what are the things maybe that made us think that there was a vibe shift? What are some of the things, whether from foreign governments, from our own senators and representatives, that felt like they were a bit different? Radha, what do you think?
I mean, I think sort of two things happened kind of in near real time to each other. And one was just truly horrific photos, I think, coming out that I think linked to, as Loren mentioned, a number of criticisms. And I think the other piece is a sort of country level recognition of what was actually happening that was hard to fully elide over. So you saw places like France and Canada really calling out and recognizing Palestine as an effort to put this on the radar. I think putting those two pieces together, it was hard. It becomes a lot harder for established institutions to sort of turn away or focus on it. And I think that none of these pieces alone probably would do it, but I think the confluence of them happening in a period of time, and in a news cycle that could admit it, frankly, without other crazy things happening, probably that's kind of my view.
So, as you mentioned, France and Canada both said that they plan to recognize Palestine as an independent state at the United Nations General Assembly in September. The UK made a similar-ish statement, but had some other kind of restrictions, or is almost more of a negotiating bid. Loren, what caught your eye and kind of in this shifting winds this last week?
So I think the vibe shift that feels so callous to be able to call it that way, but like the vibe shift that like I think I am seeing is going from a description of crisis that is occurring in Gaza to Israeli actions are a direct cause and intended, like, or a direct cause of that crisis, and are indeed probably intentionally so a cause of that crisis. And the rhetoric going from bad things are happening, Israel is involved, to bad things are happening, Israel is driving that, and hearing that sort of rhetoric much more actively from a number of different voices that make it's not that the voices themselves individually make a difference, it's the fact that they are saying it is a new shift, and that is from a number of
wide range of
yes,
countries and organizations, right?
yep, Israeli human rights groups who are using the term genocide in a very very I don't want to say taboo, but in a very like line crossing way. U.S. politicians, I mean, we've seen particularly actions from Democrats, but also from Republicans, Marjorie Taylor Greene, as well as President Trump, both expecting very extreme concern. But also, like, John Thune is similarly saying, like, I agree with President Trump. We need to do something about this. And like people asking for very direct intervention by President Trump. You see a number. It's not uncommon for former Israeli security officials from a number of different organizations to be active in their politics, but there's been some fairly unprecedented rhetoric and communication from former Israeli security officials from the Mossad, Shin Bet, and the military and otherwise, who sent a letter not to their president, or sorry, not to their prime minister, but to President Trump, urging him to pressure Netanyahu to end the war. And then there's lots of other examples like that, but I think that it went from people are continuously raising this as a crisis to people have changed their rhetoric and want to announce that they are changing their view on this. We saw this from Senator Slotkin and others saying that, like, I want you to know that here is my view now, and that view is different than what it was before.
And I mean, so I'm pretty persuaded that there was some shift in the domestic politics in the U.S. to a degree, and certainly in the international politics of kind of how the West, in particular, wants to address this crisis. But it really comes down to, I think, and there's certainly some other analysts who would agree, not just the state relationship between U.S. and Israel, really the personal relationship between Trump and Netanyahu. The war is increasingly unpopular in Israel. There was a survey cited on the Economist podcast this morning that over 80% of Israelis want the war to end in order to get the hostages back. Netanyahu has a sliver of a majority in an extreme right-wing cabinet, and that's really who he's, in political science terms, that's the selectorate that he's really, gearing toward. Do we think that this, shift in the political cost benefit analysis, to use another very crass understanding of a absolutely terrible crisis, do we think that this actually gets us closer to either humanitarian relief or conflict resolution? Or is this just sort of, horse race, but for international politics?
Look, I have like two competing minds on this. On the one hand, like just war is horrific, right? And I don't think I'm breaking any news saying this. October 7th was horrific. What happened in that was horrific. The starvation and killing of families and children, people lining up for aid is impossible to watch. It's just truly horrible, right? So this is all horrific. When that concept of war becomes a reality of war to electorates, I do think that matters. It is extremely hard to do that breakthrough. And you see it occasionally on things like civilian casualty. You see it occasionally on truly mass human suffering. And so I do think that changes political calculus because that breakthrough really brings home how horrific war is and creates political pressure that creates space for solutions. So that's like one mind. The other mind is all the evidence we have on this. And I did work on civilian casualties sort of earlier in my career on looking at like what these do. It's very transient, right? Like that breakthrough happens, people recognize it. In the moment of salience, there is opportunity if people want it, but it's also transient. And if you want to wait out the electorate understanding of how bad war is, you can. And you saw that in the Syrian conflict, right? Where
Yeah.
there were definitely peaks of it, of the horrors of that breaking through, but also a real tolerance on all sides, frankly, to allow it to continue. And so it's not clear to me which one of those wins, the horrors of what we are seeing on all sides, or the ability for that to fade away all too rapidly and let it continue. And that, I think, is the political question.
I, I I wish I did not agree with you, but I agree with you, Radha, in terms of the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis and the photos that came out in that time period drew a tremendous amount of attention and emergent or emergency aid that was driven in that period of time. It did not really change much of any policy at all towards what was going on in Syria. Drew a lot of attention, got a lot of dollars that were very good and help in terms of helping an immediate crisis, but it didn't even attempt to address the larger system at all. And I think that you could see a moment right now. I think there's a lot of possibilities here that like if that wave of pressure continues and continues urgently, you could see change. But one shift that is maybe different, and I would be curious to study this over time, is this language around responsibility or accountability of Israel. You see more so now. And it's not that it wasn't there before, but you see it more so now in terms of what is happening in Gaza. What salience does that have over the long term? Is it just an immediate thing, or is it something that you start to see be more resident into isolation or perspective on Israel, not only in terms of just public views, but also in terms of diplomatic relationships, to include the long-term relationship between the United States and Israel in terms of their security relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think my only coda to that is two things. One, the Saudis have become reengaged in the last couple of weeks in terms of pressuring Hamas. I think they issued some comments that were fairly critical of Hamas, and as well working with the French on a broader declaration. Again, I think geared toward the United Nations General Assembly meeting in September. The second is, as best I can tell, kind of reading between the lines, what caught President Trump's interest in this last week when he was traveling was Melania's interest. And it's possible that she remains an advocate or an interested, just observer that continues to keep this in his ear in a way that's not really a function of any, ongoing process, but more, have you done anything about this? This is still happening. What are we doing to do this? And I don't know, that could be something of an interesting dynamic. But it's the transience of the issue is hard to underestimate.
That's yeah. You all may be able to jog my memory, but I think this happened in his prior administration too, perhaps with regard to Syrian civilian casualties at that point in time. And I don't recall like the long term impact that is, but like that cycle that you just mentioned that's not the first time.
Yeah.
So I will first commend to you a number of other experts who have studied this issue, this conflict, the long-term implications of this in different ways than all of us have. But I thought that I think we all thought that as we called it, the vibe shift was a moment worth studying. It's also one where I like I say, it's crass to call it a vibe shift, but it's also one where I can see people protecting their reputations a bit now in terms of like how they are coming out and commenting on this as well. To shift over to a no more positive topic, but one that we thought worth addressing, our eyes were caught last week by the firing of the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But as part of not just like that incredible story there, but also as part of a longer story that has been happening over the last several months on federal data, federal evidence, and the federal statistical apparatus and the work that it does within our own economy. And there's a lot to this, and we can probably have a number of conversations. But I'll just start with a little bit of background that there is probably a huge and probably relatively unknown role for many of you in terms of the federal government's role in producing statistics and data, in collecting it, in sharing it, and analyzing it, and using it for different purposes. There are at least 300,000 federal data sets, and they span any number of different possibilities that you have not even contemplated before, but also do a lot of things that you do see on a regular basis when it comes to economic reports, unemployment, labor markets, and lots of things that impact the markets and politics. If you listen to Marketplace, you know all the music that comes out every time there's a new report. And for the beginning of this administration, they have pushed a lot of buttons of folks who care about this. They have done a lot of work around disbanding advisory committees or other organizations that are active in this space, talking about changes to how GDP is calculated, limiting access to grants and other funding that relates to evidence development or program evaluation. And you've taking a lot of essential data sets offline. And there's actually some great work, if you're interested, by an organization called America's Essential Data, which not only tracks what is missing now from the federal data apparatus, but also the value that that data has in individual lives and how it impacts not just us dorky people who are talking on this podcast, but also individuals across the country who might rely on it for things like being able to get access to a flight that wouldn't otherwise come to their small community because they need it for cancer treatment. So with all of those changes, makes a lot of folks like us who are nerds who care about research evidence, makes us very nervous because it's not just access to it, but the ability to trust these systems that we rely on. Like it's one thing to know that the data is there. It's another thing to know that the data is reliable, trustworthy, and being produced by people whose role that is. There's been already a ton of questions about how data is being used that we've talked about before on this podcast. But just stepping back a little bit, I want to hear first from Radha on a baseline for this around federal data and statistics. They are seen as the bedrock of a lot of our policy, our economic stability, transparency. And I think so much of it is just pretty invisible. And I would love to hear a little bit about why so many sectors see an independent federal data infrastructure as absolutely essential. Like who relies on it? It's obvious and maybe less obvious.
Yeah. So I want to start this by saying if you're an economist and you listen to this podcast, one, thank you. And two, like these jobs are some of the best jobs that economists get coming out of their PhD programs. These are like coveted jobs because learning this data is so rich and important for like future research and careers that many really talented economists either have started their careers in these or have worked in adjacent ways, in particular with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but more broadly with a range of economic statistics organizations and statistics organizations more broadly throughout the government. So it is, I just want to take a minute to say how truly awesome the workforce that does this is and how much it matters that they do this even under these really difficult conditions. So with that said, I spent some time really thinking about how to explain how important this is. And I think the way to think about it is we have trillion-dollar industries that are founded on the fact that they were able to figure out how to leverage precise, targeted, accurate data to target ads, to search information, to deploy technology, to get cars to exactly where you want to be within minutes of you asking them, like an Uber, to deliver your groceries to exactly where you want it to be. All of that sits on a data infrastructure that these companies created that was reliable, accurate, and trustworthy. And having worked in some of these companies, the standards you start thinking about on how to do that, when I was at one large tech company, the first place you start to look at how you manage the accuracy and trustworthiness of your data is the standards put out by the US government. So I think it's helpful to ground ourselves there, because the credibility of that data is so incredibly important to the ability to make accurate decisions in the government, yes, but also to set the standard for what best practice is on accurate, transparent, and reliable data collection and data reporting, which doesn't mean it's always perfect. It doesn't mean they don't make errors, but all of the processes by which it's collected, managed, and then reported on are transparent, which allows then these methodologically rigorous approaches to looking at unemployment, inflation, wage growth. It drives things like business investment decisions and policymaker decisions. It can be married up with surveys that are linked on key identifiers to help you understand everything from how Americans are spending their time and how that relates to their income, to the range of gaps they have in the ability of things to purchase, to their basic needs in terms of jobs and wages and housing costs. And all of that is what drives the government's ability to make evidence-based policy, especially as it relates to the American people and American businesses. And so undermining that at a fundamental level undermines the ability for effective policymaking, no matter how big or small you want that policy is. And that's why you see so many economists in particular, but I think evidence-based policy folks in general, really horrified at the kind of recent set of events.
So at the same time as this was going on, less than it seems like several months ago, but less than a week ago, 2 weeks ago, we were talking about President Trump ostensibly threatening to fire the head of the Federal Reserve and some of the implications of that. So I'm curious about, like, how does this intersect? How like economists freaked out about about that event, they freaked out about this event. How are these intersecting right now in the minds of our economist friend?
Yeah, so just two parts to this. One is the Federal Reserve decisions themselves actually rely on a lot of this BLS data. So it's not surprising that this is the target of particular attack, because if you don't want an independent central bank, you will need to undermine any ability for them to make independent decisions. And a critical input to that is reliable and accurate statistics, right? So that piece of it is really straightforward. I think there's a second piece with this broader idea of political influence as something that should drive economic policy rather than sort of quality and neutral responses based on theories of how the economy should operate. And it's interesting because it's fundamentally anti-capitalist, right? The idea that political government considerations from the party that's in power should drive how economic decisions are made is really distinct from what the US has leaned into, over at kind of 80, 90 years now at a minimum, which is you have these measures of market forces. And what you're trying to do is balance the market forces to maximize sort of trade opportunities. I don't mean that in an international sense, but just in a commerce sense, while minimizing the amount the government needs to intervene. So you want to tap it in on the extremes and otherwise let it ride. And so the change in that, both on the statistics and on the policymaking side, is a really disturbing trend overall on what that means for government interference in the economy.
I really love when I get to pull out Radha the economist. It just makes me very happy that like that entity exists. All right, so the hiring.
Sorry, can I jump in there too, Loren?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think, even to pull that string even farther from Radha, and not to pull it into political science necessarily, but I do think that it's a question of, do you see the economy as a public good?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is the growing economy a thing that is just a net good for the American public, possibly the world? But I'm willing to be a nationalist about this, at least in some ways, right? And that whether it's a rising tide lifts all boats, or a larger pie means a larger slice for everyone, right? If you don't buy into that as a basic premise, and I don't think the president does, then what you want then is an economy that makes you look good, right? Or makes you better off, or makes your friends better off. And or at least you have some real sense about who deserves a good slice of that pie versus who doesn't. And so I do think a lot of this comes to both the degree to which Trump himself just wants to be mucking in the politics in a very personalist and mercantilist sort of way. But it also comes down to whether you see, the economy as a public good and your job as president as being a steward of other public goods. And I think on a range of issues that we could look at, universities, NIH, a number of other things, there's a very different, bordering on zero concept of public goods that animate a lot of those decisions.
So with I've mentioned how we've had the firing of the BLS commissioner. There's been a lot of other actions that have backgrounded that are, if not equally concerning, that are steps in that direction. But I'll just go over a couple here, but I want to get explicitly to this question of her firing and what kind of steps that we see with that. Some of the examples we've seen are the elimination of the evidence team at the Office of Management and Budget that sort of oversaw the evidence ecosystem and helped be its champion within the White House, the shuttering of EPA's Office of Research and Development, any number of leadership vacancies that we see across the data, statistical, and evaluation offices, effectively the closure, though not quite, of the Institute for Education Sciences as a Department of Education, and a lot of structural reforms that have been coming up, like consolidating the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and BLS. But with the firing of, I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, I'll try, Erica McEnteffer. Immediately after the release of the jobs report, the president came out not only in public, but also in a press release and accused the commissioner of manipulating data for political reasons. And so I actually I want to take him literally, if not seriously, or seriously, not literally, whichever one. I want to understand what he meant by that. What's the deal? What it was the basis of his accusation there? And in particular, I would love to better understand this commentary around later revising the jobs reports when new data comes in, and both what is that process and what's the merits of that process?
Yeah, so let me just, on a pure process point, say the BLS, like literally every statistical agency and statistical organization in the world, has a process to update their data for a variety of reasons. Largely, those reasons relate to late arriving data. So that's, data that comes in after they've snapped the chalk line and how their analysis that meaningfully impact the results. Annual benchmarking, which is roughly you want to compare your data with other more comprehensive records, especially for sample-based data like the BLS does. And that can impact both the average, which is like your best guess at sort of a bunch of the inputs, and the spread of those numbers, the statistical deviation from them, and then errors, which happen again in all large statistical organization. And to be clear, do happen in BLS. And the way they happen in BLS is they literally have a process for handling errors. And so on the
But I think it's also, there's you mean errors almost in a statistical sense, Radha. You don't mean like could be a mistake. Could be a data entry error.
Yep.
But part of this is sort of the data is collected via survey. The surveys can be noisy. Additional responses come in later. So the error is also noise around the initial estimate. They provided
but
the best
there's also data entry and processing errors that
Sure.
happen. And I guess I think it's helpful to be transparent about that, because the BLS is transparent about it.
Yep.
They document transparently the reason for their correction. And to Erin's point, most of the time, the corrections are not from data entry errors or analytic errors. They're from later arriving data or more comprehensive information that updates the analysis. And then they have a transparent and peer-reviewed process by which they update the data, announce how they updated the data, and show both their updated data and the old data so that you can do the analysis and make decisions yourself. And that is sort of part of statistical best practice. And again, something that happens kind of across the board. And so to weaponize that is to really undermine the ability both to create predictable statistical releases and then to disincentivize the updates to those that will make it more accurate and usable for markets and researchers and analysts and everyone. And I think that is sort of both to answer your question and your not question. There are errors. The BLS has processes to address those errors. To Erin's point, some of those are processing, but a lot of them are just updated information that comes in over time. And that is exactly what we want our statistical agencies to be doing.
So while
To
agreeing
Lauren,
with
but
all of it,
to your initial question though, what did he mean? I think he meant that people who were quote unquote appointed by the Biden administration, these of course are not political appointees. They are, as Radha's noted, career civil servants or executives. He thinks that they revised the growth estimates, the job estimates for May and June downward to make him look bad. That's what he thinks happened. And so he thinks the economy is growing really strongly, and these people are trying to make him look bad because they're part of a deep state conspiracy that can't understand the strength of the economy in 2025.
So I'd love to. We don't have a ton of time, but I would love to just note that, like, somebody who's coming in to, I mean, the president. Let me back up a little bit. The president, having been part of this scenario many times, he should know the game here. Like, this is something that comes out, that happens regularly. He should know, like, the ups and downs that are associated with it. As an outsider, as somebody who doesn't study this closely, as somebody who's just glancing at it, but notices that there's upward and downward revisions, it is possible to feel as though, like, or possible to question, how is it possible to game this system? Is it possible to given all the implications that, as Radha and Erin mentioned here, of, like, they have political implications, economic implications, and otherwise, it's challenging to jump into that and think that, like, okay, the up or downward changes don't have some sort of intent behind them. And I actually, one of the things that recognizing that Radha said there's all kinds of transparency in terms about how they do this, but that transparency is often towards people like us who understand how those work. And it's less so towards people who are not like us, who understand how all the errors may take place in that. And it's something that it's been on my mind of, like, what are there ways that President Trump is not the audience for this, but are there ways that others could better understand how and why those revisions take place? And I don't know the answer to that, but it's something that has been on my mind in terms of, like, the ultimate audiences here. The audiences are obviously all the ones that we've talked about, but their audiences are also the people who are seeing this as a political maneuver right now.
I wonder if part of this is, there's a lot of debate in hurricane forecasting.
Yes.
About how you forecast the path of the eye and the uncertainty around the path of the eye, as well as the broader, like, impact of the storm, and how people interpret that, kind of blob that goes along the very specific track of the eye, and whether they understand the estimation that goes into that. I think it's a similar sort of thing. And you've actually seen, or at least I'm a weather nerd, so I've seen these discussions on, weather blogs, which you should definitely read. But there's a debate as sort of like public communications and public science communications about how best to do that. Radha, you tell me if there's been a similar discussion prior to last Friday in kind of the economics or business world, or if instead just the discussion is, we understand how this works and we sort of manage this at an elite level. We're not trying to manage hurricane evacuations for everybody in the Florida Panhandle or Texas coast.
No, I'm laughing only because I think it's actually been on the sort of the opposite evolution. There used to be, I was an intern at the Council of Economic Advisors when I was in college, and so I have a long history of following economic data through the system, sad to say. And there used to be a norm actually of having this very deliberate window of releasing the statistics, not have anyone other than the statistical experts briefing the numbers, and then letting the nerds kind of hash it out for like a 24-hour period. That really helped everyone understand what was in the numbers and what wasn't, and then report on it more accurately, and then go. And then that window sort of compressed over time, and the political spin, bluntly, from both parties, it's not partisan, took over. And I think a lot of the conversation has been on, how do we get back to that period of time where you had this elite, to your point, Erin, elites conversation on what the numbers really mean. But there is a missing conversation on not the elites debate, but like how do we really want people to understand these numbers, like the
Yeah.
American public whose taxpayer dollars pay this, and what should it mean to them, and what would be useful, and how do we make this more accessible to them? And I don't think, to use your weather analogy, I don't think there is a comparable analogy, but there should be, because there's not the acute evacuation question, but these are the numbers that should be reflecting in either validating or helping people understand the economy around them. And if there's not a good way to translate to them, that's not good. And I don't think there is. Like, I think it's a good flag that conversation doesn't exist.
So there's like probably several hours more of conversation that we could have here. I'm going to close with a complicated question that I'm going to make you answer simply, because while this was a horrible signal, we do not yet have a further indicator that that economic data has been corrupted in any way. There may be changes. We just know that this removal was a big signal. What other signals are you watching for in terms of things that would alarm you about the independence of federal statistics or economic data? And I'm challenging you to answer this briefly because we do have to get to our interview next.
I have two short things, which are removal of methodology reports and
Mhm.
requirements that statistical releases have to be validated by the White House before release.
And I have kind of a flip side answer to that, which is the signal is not just the data may be corrupted. The signal is that the White House is uninterested in kind of objectively knowing what's going on. And, whether that's about the economy or, a threat to the United States or an ongoing conflict, I think that that's, a real problem. Radha and I both did conflict assessments in Afghanistan. Maybe there's a particular, nut in my craw around people who don't want to know how bad things are going. And senior leaders who aren't receptive to that. I mean, I just think that that's going to flow down so quickly and across so many different agencies and kind of problem sets in the government. We already knew it sort of by instinct and kind of by public comment from the president. But this specific thing, firing the person responsible for jobs data, on jobs day, is just, I feel bad for folks in the intelligence community, first and foremost. So maybe that's the answer to your question is, Loren, is whether or not there's fallout in the intelligence community next.
The one that I'm watching is more of a tacit signal, and that is around the departure via RIF or early retirement or otherwise of a huge percentage of the statistical agency staff, estimates anywhere between 15% up to 40%, which is not just a matter of people are leaving who are experts, but actual capacity to be able to execute as so much of the work that we're talking about here, and then having real implications and being able to collect the data that has all the impact we're talking about.
Okay, it is time for warning signs, and we are going to talk all things trade and tariffs. To help walk us through this, I'm delighted to welcome Emily Benson. Emily has previously worked at the Department of Commerce, at the Supply Chain Center, and now is the head of strategy at Minerva Technology Futures, where she focuses on geopolitical risks that affect trade and investment decisions. So, Emily, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a great way to start the day with something called warning signs.
So maybe we'll just start in on tariffs, which is kind of how did we get here? Sort of what is going on? What is the overall Trump theory of the case on tariffs? We've talked about this a couple of times on the show, but maybe you can help just provide a little bit of intro context for our listeners.
So if I could just be a little provocative at the top, I have been on this little tour around Washington recently trying to correct what I think is sort of a mistaken viewpoint on what's happening with the administration. And this is that a lot of people think there's no plan, there's no strategy. We can't make sense of what's going on. And I actually think that's a little bit misguided, because if you look at where we were a year ago, or even in the first Trump administration, they've been exceptionally clear about telegraphing where they stand, what the objectives are, and that tariffs will play a very prominent role in their economic statecraft and domestic defense in the economic sense toolkit. And we're essentially picking up where we left off after the first administration. I'll also note that in the Project 2025 document that has really informed a lot of the administration's strategies and certainly was quite prominent on the campaign trail, a lot of the guidance in that document is being borne out in some of the policies that we see here. So that's another data point in support of the idea that there actually is a very cohesive strategy emanating from the administration. And I think that's a very separate discussion, of course, than the implementation hiccups that we've all experienced, particularly since the month of April. So just very quickly, why are we doing this? Why do we see these policies coming out of the White House? I think there are three main things to keep in mind here. One is to expedite reshoring. There was bipartisan consensus, and I worked on this firsthand in the Commerce Department this time last year, that some of the outsourcing that we've experienced over the last generation has actually left fairly significant vulnerabilities throughout the US economy, which we all learned firsthand during the COVID supply crunches. So the idea is if you have a run on supplies, you can't get what you need, that actually has downstream labor effects and can cause negative ripples throughout the US economy. The second motivation for the administration is to raise revenue through tariffs. And actually, this is going to make them quite sticky. If you look at this time last year, tariffs accounted for $78 billion in federal income. That's now up to $152 billion. And the greater share of revenue the tariffs account for, the less politically salient it will be to call for their removal. So that's certainly somewhere that I would look for. The third and final point I would make is that this is partially a consumption tax. We hear in the news all the time that these will be passed on to consumers. We can debate the exact rate. I don't think it's as easy as, 15% tariff equals you pay 15% more. But this is partially a consumption tax. And this goes back to what former USTR Bob Lighthizer said in his book, which is that Americans don't actually need 8 televisions. And that's controversial in a lot of ways, especially because we do have a consumption-based economy. But that is definitely part of the agenda. Zooming way out, all of this is in service of trying to reinvigorate the defense industrial base, which has really been one of the key focuses of people in the administration.
So, okay, so we have this objective of trying to expedite reshoring. We're trying to sort of jumpstart the economy in certain sectors as well. So where are we now? We didn't get the 90 deals in 90 days, but sort of in the current state of play, place in the narrative, what's going on?
Great question. That's actually harder to answer than you'd anticipate. There have been some deals that have been concluded, and I would just caveat the word deal because we're not really sure what these agreements are. Are they an agreement in principle about a framework to negotiate a deal? And if you follow a lot of former trade negotiators on LinkedIn, which I do, you can really see their frustration come through every day and wanting this legally binding text that everyone can parse through. And there have been some PDFs put on the White House website, of course. But basically, the first one past the post was the United Kingdom. There have been others with varying degrees of certainty. I think Vietnam looked pretty good, only to kind of disintegrate in the ensuing couple of weeks. We have others with the European Union and Japan, which are mostly focused around keeping tariffs at a 15% rate and then calling for both foreign partners to make very sizable investments in the US. Again, we don't really know the degree to which these are legally binding or how they will actually come to fruition. The one here that sort of stands out is the United Kingdom. To my knowledge, they're the only one that's actually planning to submit this through their parliamentary approval process. So that would be akin to us putting it through Congress, which would be a more traditional approach to these deals. It'll be interesting to see if other countries do the same or if the details are really hard to get ironed out and some countries could throw up their hands and say, you know what, we're going to stick with the tariff rates that we receive and we'll pick it up at a later date. So we'll have to see how it plays out.
So one question that I had as I was, watching this kind of play out in the public press is why are we negotiating all of these bilaterally? Wasn't there like at one point kind of a set of global rules, perhaps a world trade organization of some kind that helped set, I don't know, a general set of tariffs and trade elements? I understand why President Trump wants to do this bilaterally, but how has this come about that we are now doing kind of 1v1, 90 deals, 90 days sort of trade negotiations with varying levels of veracity?
Yeah, it certainly is very ambitious, especially let's all pour one out for the staff who are working on this on a day-to-day basis. It's certainly a big workload. But if you actually look back at the WTO conversation, there's an elephant in the room, which is the inability of the WTO to confront the China problem. And here, China has been engaged in very visceral levels of overcapacity that have had negative impacts on prices and economic success in developed countries like the United States and Europe. And the WTO system has really failed to rein in Chinese non-market economic behavior. The WTO itself also is exceedingly brittle. And so even a couple of years ago, there were conversations about could a smaller grouping of countries pull out and do a kind of a sub-working group thing on trade and the environment to make it easier to buy and sell climate-related goods and services. The WTO was not convinced that that was okay per the rules, and it kind of forced this discussion about climate to fall apart inside the system. And so you have this combination of can't really confront China, it can't confront climate change, it does not really stand up in today's environment, especially with national security motivated technology controls. So there are just bigger questions about whether or not that's the most effective framework. And I think the administration here in the United States is recognizing that if you go out and negotiate all of these bilateral deals, that's a great way of gaining very targeted leverage over your foreign partners. So instead of setting these broad parameters, they're ready to go in for the kill, maximize what they can get from foreign partners. And this is a very different approach than we've seen in the past.
So maybe just, kind of zooming way back out, do we think Trump has been successful here? Does it look like the deals are accomplishing what he wants? Kind of how should we interpret where we are, even with these framework agreements versus where the administration wants to get to?
It's a great question. I think it's kind of too early to tell in the beginning. So by success metrics, share of revenue is up. So that's actually very much a success for the administration. They have also been able to get very significant concessions from some trading partners, including agreements to make additional foreign investment. That being
Do we
said,
think that those are going to happen? Do we think that those investments are actually going to materialize? Because I remember there being, China had made some commitments about buying agricultural goods in the first Trump administration. So that's one. Having worked on this from the defense industry side, commitments to make investments are always an interesting thing to solve in the out years, as we say.
yeah, and so I think in the administration's defense, part of what derailed the China Phase One agreement was COVID. The global economy did
Fair.
shut down, so that is a data point that's worth keeping in mind. I do think a lot of these investment packages are basically upcycling existing packages, and that'll probably be the same going forward. If you actually look at the Japan versus the EU packages, immediately in the next 72 hours after the US-Japan deal was concluded, we saw different statements from leadership on both sides. And the US was under the impression that Japan would essentially hand over $550 billion and that the US would then be able to distribute that however it wanted. That would
And there was
be
some similar daylight on the EU pieces after the meeting with von der Leyen.
Yeah, exactly. And foreign governments don't just give you a blank check of $550 billion. So that would be asking a lot, to put it that way. On the EU side, also, von der Leyen kind of course corrected a little bit right after and said, actually, we don't have this liquid cash and I would have to raise it from the private sector. And so I'd have to sort of poke them to make these additional investments. And zooming way out, if you look at Europe's own current efforts to reinvigorate their defense industrial base, it's a full court press ahead to get private capital mobilized in the European market. And so the likelihood that they would turn and kind of outsource some of their scarce capital for defense purposes or for advanced technology purposes at this time would be very surprising.
Well, there's obviously a lot going on here and a lot to watch in this space. So thank you, Emily, for joining us. And with that, I think we've dived enough into economic topics for this episode, and maybe we can move on to the Gong Show. Lauren, what do we have on tap this week?
So we are a podcast, which means that, believe it or not, we also listen to podcasts. And I wanted to, you both listen to many more podcasts than I do. So I actually am doing this out of my own pure curiosity, but also hopefully listeners will enjoy it too. I wanted to hear about first a podcast that you think makes you smarter. And then also podcasts that give your brain a nice bout of relaxation, a nice glass of rosé for the brain. Radha, I know that you are a podcast absorber. What are your answers to that?
Okay, so I really enjoy and learn much from the Hard Fork podcast, Hard
Fork
podcasts,
Okay.
which covers a range of tech related topics, unsurprisingly for me, I suppose. But I think most interestingly, it covers it for both in a way that I think helps both tech and non-tech related audiences sort of understand what is both interesting and weird about it. And kind of highly recommended it. You know, it's one of these podcasts that I wouldn't say I listen to every single episode, but it it scratches the itch when you're like, what on earth is going on with that? Like there's a Hard Fork podcast for that. And for my Rosé podcast, I love Even the Royals, which is a podcast that is talking about just random tidbits of like royals. They're just like you, but for all royals in all societies historically over time. And it'll cover everything from like their dresses didn't fit and they had nothing to wear, to their shoes were uncomfortable and they had a plan for changing when they went to dances, to, you know, how do you decide what to feed your bajillion person feast, and et cetera, and et cetera. And it is
Incredibly on
delightful
brand.
and the perfect brain candy you need after you've listened to Hard Fork or The Daily or Sirens, and just want to feel light and fluffy.
Erin, what about you?
So I'm a pretty big fan of the Economist's morning podcast, The Intelligence, for international affairs. I think it's pretty great. It's also very well done, so I really enjoy that. I also listen to Channels, which is on the Vox network, with Peter Kafka. It used to be called Recode Media, and it covers some tech stuff, but sort of tech and media. And so it also will be like, you know, ESPN is going to buy a stake of the NFL. What is that about? Or it'll have something about like somebody wrote a book on HBO. And so let's talk about kind of the history of HBO and why HBO does weird things now. So that's, you know, makes you smarter, but is also kind of, you know, adjacent to the pop culture things that I like a lot. Speaking of pop culture, on the things that make my brain, you know, relax a little, I love the Sam Sanders podcast. He used to be on It's Been a Minute on NPR, and he has a new podcast out of KCRW in California. It is fantastic. I just listened to 2 episodes talking about all kinds of interesting things. So Sam Sanders' podcast is fantastic. The other one I also really like is the Book Riot podcast, which is about books and kind of the publishing industry. I got into it. I'd listened to several episodes and I realized at least one of the hosts went to the University of Kansas. Then I realized the other host also went to the University of Kansas. And not only that, went to my high school. So I'm now on a bit of a crusade to link us with the Book Riot folks. But it is really good. I've gotten a lot of good recommendations. The one, you know, piece of folks might want to look for is each month they do like a power ranking of like books of August or June or July. And so they kind of go through things that are coming out that month and figure out, you know, what looks good. So that's kind of it's a great way to get different book recs than most of us normally come across. And, you know, that's fun. Do you have any that follow in these categories, Loren?
I am a very much more sporadic listener of podcasts, usually when I'm cleaning. The ones that I particularly enjoy that I go back to most regularly are 99% Invisible, which has been around for forever. That is ostensibly about design. But right now, I'll mention has a little series that it's doing on the breakdown of the Constitution with at least the first episode. I don't know what the future ones will be with Nicole Hannah-Jones. And their latest episode kind of dives into the preamble, and like it's just been I love the entire 99% Invisible Uvoir, but this one was particularly great. I also like a podcast called Statecraft because I'm entirely on brand with Santi Ruiz that deals with what it sounds like. What is state capacity, and what are cool and interesting things about how governments invest in or deliver the world around us, whether that be high-speed rail or foreign aid or artificial intelligence or otherwise. On the more fun side, I honestly do not listen to fun podcasts unless I'm listening to Wait, Don't Tell Me, of which I am a unashamed fan.
Wait, please shoot me. God, I hate
God,
that
I love
show.
it so
Oh
much.
my
It makes me so
God.
happy. I would say that my equivalent is usually listening to Brene Brown books, which is just like if you've listened, I love you, Brene Brown. You're amazing, but I want to be real that if I've listened to one of your books, I've probably listened to all of your books. But it's so soothing to be able to listen to and think about, how do I be more vulnerable? How do I get my team to share their emotions, and et cetera, et cetera. So love Brene Brown.
I'm so glad you read those books so I don't have to, Loren. That's really how I feel about that right now.
Let me tell you, it's a real thing to go from a team that as at a nonprofit that like is all into Brene Brown to go work in national security where maybe not as much. So you just it's a lesson.
Just imagine the other way around where you get so many emotions. I don't want you to be your authentic self, guys.
All right. Well, we'll come back to that in a future episode. I have no doubt.
So with that, we are now done with one more episode of Sirens. If you love us, I was about to say if you love us or you hate us, but really only if you love us, please leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform of choice and share our show with friends you think might enjoy it. We'll see you next time.